She was standing in the middle of my hayfield with a microphone, 60 strangers behind her, a bounce house inflated on ground my father bought in 1958, a children's charity banner zip-tied to my own fence post. A local news camera pointed at her face while she thanked the crowd for coming out to support such a wonderful cause. On land she had never once asked me about, never once called me about, never once sent so much as a postcard to the one name printed on the recorded deed. I was standing 20 feet away at my own gate when she said it. And of course, a huge thank you to our wonderful neighbor for generously donating the grounds today. The crowd applauded. A child near the bounce house clapped both hands over her head. The news camera operator panned slowly across the hayfield, getting his B-roll, completely unaware that the man standing quietly near the fence line in a flannel shirt was the property owner, and that every second of footage he was collecting was becoming evidence. I didn't say a word. I put my hands in my pockets and watched her take a small bow. My name is Walter Hadley. For 34 years I examined land titles for a living. Chains of ownership, easements, recorded deeds, the kind of paperwork most people never read until it's too late. Which meant I understood, standing in that field on a Saturday morning in May, exactly what Donna Ashcroft had just done to herself on camera. She had publicly claimed a donation that was never offered, never requested, never granted, by me, the only person with the legal standing to grant it. She had said it into a microphone in front of 60 witnesses while a news crew rolled tape. I never fought back that morning. I didn't have to. She was doing all the work for me. The honest answer, if anyone had asked me why I didn't walk up and shut the whole thing down the moment I saw the bounce house going up on my pasture, is that I spent 3 decades watching families lose land because they reacted in the heat of a moment instead of waiting for the paper to catch up to the truth. So I waited. I watched her hand the cordless mic to a 10-year-old in a soccer jersey to read off the sponsor list. I watched the news van park its tires 6 feet from my fence post, and I kept watching because what I was looking at wasn't a problem that needed to be stopped. It was a case that was building itself. This isn't a story about a man losing his temper. I never raised my voice that whole spring. I never posted a comment, wrote an angry letter, or once stood in Donna Ashcroft's driveway demanding an explanation. What I did instead was something closer to my old job than to revenge. I watched, I documented, and I let a woman who'd never once checked a property record build the entire case against herself. One public statement at a time, while I kept my hands folded and my mouth shut until the morning the facts were ready to speak for themselves. By the time anyone else understood what was happening, it had already happened. Weeks earlier, in a stack of dated paper sitting quietly in a drawer in my kitchen. My father, Earl Hadley, bought this ranch in the spring of 1958, 140 acres of grazing land and scrub oak about 11 miles outside town, back when the nearest paved road stopped 2 miles short of our gate, and the county still delivered mail by horseback to the Pruitt place over the ridge. He paid $11,000 for it, in cash, money he'd saved working cattle for the Lindqvist outfit since he was 16. I have the original deed. I have the original survey. I have the abstract of title going back to the 1890s land patent, because that's the kind of thing you keep when you've spent your career telling other people they should have kept theirs. My father never had my education, but he understood the principle better than most lawyers I worked with. Earl Hadley grew up dirt poor outside Joplin, the third of 6 children, and went to work full-time on the Lindqvist cattle operation at 16, because there wasn't money for anything else. He saved for 12 years, doing every job on that ranch from fence repair to calving to driving cattle to the rail yard in the fall. And when he finally had $11,000 saved, he didn't buy a house in town like most men his age would have. He bought land, 140 acres nobody else wanted because the well water ran high in iron and the access road washed out twice a year. He used to say a man who owns land owns something that can't be repossessed by a bad decision somebody else makes on his behalf. I was 9 years old when we moved out here. I remember the well water tasting like iron the first summer before my father got the casing replaced. I remember him walking the fence line every Sunday after church, not because anything was wrong, but because he believed a man who didn't know his own boundaries didn't really own anything at all. I walked it with him most weeks, half listening the way boys do, while he pointed out a leaning post here, a sagging strand of wire there, narrating the whole 140 acres like he was reading a book only he could see. "Why do we walk it every week if nothing's ever wrong?" I asked him once, maybe 12 years old, more interested in getting back to whatever I'd been doing before church. He stopped, looked at the fence line running out toward the ridge, and said, Walter, paper's just paper till somebody tries to take what's yours. Then it's the only thing that matters. Walking it keeps you ready for the day somebody tries. I didn't understand him then. I do now. He ran cattle on this place for 46 years, never more than 60 head at a time, never enough to make him wealthy, enough to keep the property taxes paid and the fences mended and 3 meals on the table for my mother, my sister Carol, and me. He died in February of 2009, 81 years old, in the same bedroom he'd slept in since 1958, and the ranch passed to me outright a few months later. No liens, no disputes, no other heirs to settle with. Carol had moved to Tucson decades earlier, married a man who sold pool equipment, and wanted nothing to do with cattle or fence repair or iron-tasting well water. The whole 140 acres came to me clean, recorded at the county courthouse in Book 412, page 86, same as it had been since the original patent. I'd spent my working life examining exactly this kind of document for other people's properties. Running my own title was the easiest closing of my career. Here's the part most of my neighbors don't know, because most of them moved in decades after we did. The Ridgeline Estates subdivision, the one that now wraps around 3 sides of my property like a horseshoe, didn't exist when my father bought this land. It wasn't platted until 1987, when a developer named Kurt Halloway bought up the old Pruitt and Schreiber parcels and carved them into 110 residential lots with a recorded plat filed at the county recorder's office, Book 1140, page 23. I know the page number because I pulled it myself, twice, for reasons that'll make sense shortly. A subdivision plat does exactly one thing, legally speaking. It defines which specific parcels are bound by whatever covenants and restrictions the developer files alongside it. My 140 acres were never inside that boundary line. They were never part of the plat. My father's deed predates the subdivision by 29 years, and no covenant filed after the fact can reach backward and grab land that was never included in the first place. People assume an HOA's authority is like weather. It just sort of blankets everything nearby. It isn't. It's a contract, recorded against specific parcels, and parcels that were never part of the agreement aren't bound by it, no matter how close the fence line sits to the clubhouse pool. I am not, and have never been, a member of the Ridgeline Estates Homeowners Association. I pay no dues, I attend no mandatory meetings. For years I went to maybe 1 annual meeting out of 3, mostly as a courtesy to neighbors I liked, mostly to hear about drainage easements and the speed bump petition, never because anyone could compel me to show up. My career gave me a particular relationship to paper that most people never develop, because most people only deal with a deed twice in their life. Once when they buy a house, once when they sell it. I spent 34 years examining nothing but. I worked first for a regional title company out of Springfield, then independently the last 14 years before I retired in 2014, doing the unglamorous work of tracing chains of ownership back through decades of recorded instruments, looking for the one gap, the one missing signature, the one unreleased lien that could turn a clean-looking sale into a lawsuit 5 years down the road. It is not interesting work to describe at a dinner party. It is, however, exactly the kind of work that teaches a man patience, because the truth about land ownership is never decided by who shouts loudest in the moment. It's decided by what's recorded, in what order, by whom, and whether anyone bothered to file the right document at the right courthouse on the right date. I've seen families lose land they'd farmed for 60 years because somebody's grandfather forgot to record a deed in 1947. I've seen developers lose entire subdivisions over a misfiled easement. Paper outlasts memory, and it outlasts conviction, every single time. My life by the time any of this started was a quiet one, and I don't say that with any complaint attached to it. I kept about 40 head of cattle on the place by then, fewer than my father ever ran, mostly because I'd scaled back after retiring and didn't need the income the way he once had. I was up most mornings before 6, checked water troughs, mended what needed mending, drove into town on Thursdays for groceries and to have coffee with 2 or 3 other retired men at a diner that's been serving the same menu since 1979. It was, by any measure, an unremarkable life, built around routines I genuinely enjoyed, precisely because nothing about them required me to prove anything to anyone. I mention all this because it matters for understanding why I reacted to what happened the way I did, slowly, methodically, without panic, rather than the way a younger man with more to lose and less patience might have reacted. I'd met Donna Ashcroft maybe 4 times before any of this started. She moved into Ridgeline Estates around 2017, took over as the HOA's Events and Community Outreach Chair within about 18 months. The kind of person who runs for the position nobody else wants and then treats it like she was elected mayor. Pleasant enough at the mailbox. Sharper at meetings. The kind of sharp that comes from someone who's used to getting her way through sheer persistence rather than rank. The one real interaction we'd had before any of this was about 2 years back. She knocked on my door on a Tuesday evening, clipboard in hand, asking whether I'd be willing to donate a section of my western fence line so the HOA could put in a community garden plot that would back up against my property, her reasoning being that the soil drainage was better on my side of the boundary. I told her no politely, the way you tell someone no when you assume that's the end of it. She didn't argue. She just got a look on her face I'd later learn to recognize. Not anger, exactly. More like someone recalculating, the way a person looks when a door doesn't open the direction they expected, and they're already wondering which window might. She tried a second angle that same evening, almost as an afterthought on her way back down the porch steps. Would I consider letting the HOA run an irrigation line across the corner of my property to reach the proposed garden plot, since it would only be a few feet and wouldn't really affect anything I was using? I told her the same thing applied. She thanked me for my time in a voice that had gone noticeably cooler than when she'd arrived, got in her car, and drove off without the garden, the irrigation line, or as far as I ever heard, much enthusiasm for bringing either idea back to the board. I didn't think about that look again for almost 2 years. It was the first Tuesday of April when I found the sign. I was walking the eastern perimeter, same as my father used to, checking a sagging strand of barbed wire near the old loading chute. And there it was, zip-tied to my own gatepost, professionally printed, laminated against the weather, the kind of sign you pay a print shop for rather than knock together at home. Spring Charity, Fun Run and Picnic, Ridgeline Estates, HOA, Hadley Ranch Grounds. All welcome. A date, 6 weeks out. A time. A logo for a children's hospital fund I'd never heard mentioned by anyone, ever, at any meeting I'd attended. Nobody had called me. Nobody had written me a letter. Nobody had so much as left a voicemail asking whether the Hadley Ranch Grounds were, in fact, available, willing, or even aware. I stood there a long moment in the cool morning air, turning it over. The barbed wire I'd come out to fix could wait. I read the sign twice more, noting the small print at the bottom. A QR code linking to a registration page, a sponsor logo from the feed store in town, a line reading, "Donations gratefully accepted at the gate." Someone had clearly put real effort into this. Real money, even. A sign like that doesn't get printed on a whim. Somebody sat down, designed it, approved a proof, paid for it, and decided my gatepost was the right place to hang it, all without a single phone call to the one name on the recorded deed. I drove past the HOA's small clubhouse on my way into town later that morning, the same low-brick building where I'd attended maybe a dozen meetings over the better part of 15 years, and noticed a second sign posted to their own bulletin board out front, identical to the one zip-tied to my gate, so this wasn't some rogue committee member acting alone on a Tuesday afternoon. It had gone through whatever passed for official channels inside that organization, approved enough times by enough people that nobody along the way had thought to ask the one question that mattered. I sat in my truck in the clubhouse parking lot for a minute, engine idling, and found that genuinely more interesting than upsetting. The sheer number of people who'd apparently looked at that sign, walked past it, maybe even helped design it, and never once wondered whether the Hadley Ranch Grounds had actually agreed to host 60 strangers and a children's hospital fundraiser. I didn't tear the sign down. I took a photograph of it with my phone, the kind that automatically stamps the date and GPS coordinates into the file, the way I'd taught 100 junior examiners to document property conditions over the years out of pure habit. Then I walked back to the house, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table where my father used to do his bookkeeping, and decided I wanted to see exactly how far this was going to go before I said a single word to anyone. The HOA's Facebook page made it easy. Public group, anyone could read it, and by the following week, the Spring Charity Fun Run had its own event listing. 47 shares, a running RSVP count climbing towards 60, and ticket sales described as a $15 suggested donation per family, proceeds benefiting Children's Hope Hospital Fund. A list of confirmed vendor booths, a face painting station, a raffle for a gift basket donated by the local feed store. All of it scheduled for my hayfield, my eastern pasture, and the loading area my father built by hand in 1971. I called the county clerk's office that same week, mostly out of habit. Confirmed my parcel's plat status hadn't changed. Confirmed the recorded boundary description was still exactly what it had always been. confirmed nothing had quietly shifted underneath me while I wasn't looking. It hadn't. The 140 acres were exactly as unaffiliated with Ridgeline Estates as they'd been since 1987. I want to explain something here, because it matters for what happened later, and because 34 years in this business taught me that most people genuinely don't understand the difference between a misunderstanding and a liability. When an organization advertises an event as being hosted on a specific piece of property, when they collect money in connection with that advertised location, when they tell the public that property has been donated for the occasion, and the actual owner of that property never consented, you're no longer looking at a simple trespass. You're looking at conversion, which is the legal term for using someone else's property as though it were your own to control, and depending on how the solicitation was worded, you can be looking at something closer to fraud. Representing land use rights you don't actually have, in writing, to people handing over money on the strength of that representation. None of that requires the landowner to do anything at all. The exposure exists the moment the false representation goes out into the world. I didn't need to stop the advertising. The advertising was already doing the damage to the people who wrote it. I didn't contact Donna. I didn't contact the HOA board. I kept doing what I'd done for 34 years, which was watch the paper trail build itself. About a week into all this, I drove into town and had lunch with a man named Gordon Pruitt, a retired real estate attorney I'd worked alongside on probably 200 closings over the years. The kind of man whose judgment I trusted the way you trust a tool you've used your whole career and never once had fail you. I laid the whole thing out for him over a plate of chicken fried steak, careful and unhurried, the way you'd present any case file. He listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do, and when I finished, he set his fork down and asked me a single question. Have you given anyone, ever, any indication this kind of use was acceptable? Verbal, written, anything at all? No, I told him. Not once. He nodded slowly, the way he used to nod across a closing table when a title came back clean. Then that's the only question that matters, Walter. Everything else they're doing, the signs, the publicity, the fundraising, that's not building their case. That's building yours. You don't need to do a thing but let it keep happening. That feels like doing nothing, I said. It is doing something, Gordon said. It's just not the something most people would recognize. He didn't tell me to act differently than what I was already doing. He just confirmed, in the careful language of a man who'd spent his career being careful with language, that I was standing on solid ground and could afford to be patient about it. About 2 weeks before the event, I got a call from a woman named Marjorie Quint, the HOA's treasurer, someone I'd always found more careful than most of the board. She told me, quietly, like she wasn't entirely sure she should be telling me at all, that she'd texted Donna directly after seeing the Facebook event go up, asking point blank whether Walter Hadley had actually approved use of his property. Marjorie read me Donna's reply almost word for word, because she'd kept the text. It's basically HOA land at this point. Everyone treats it that way. He's never said anything before. I'd let that sit with me for a moment. Never said anything before, as though my silence about letting neighborhood kids fish my stock pond on a Saturday afternoon was somehow a standing invitation to host a publicized, monetized event on 140 acres I held free and clear. Marjorie said she'd pushed a little further, asked Donna if she had anything in writing from me. Donna told her not to worry about it, that it would be fine, that I was not really the confrontational type. She wasn't wrong about that. She was about to learn exactly how wrong she was about what not confrontational actually meant. About 10 days after Marjorie's call, I got a voicemail from a man identifying himself as the owner of the feed store in town, the one whose logo I'd seen printed on that laminated sign back in April. He'd left a friendly, slightly rushed message asking whether he should drop off the raffle basket directly at the Hadley place the morning of the event, or whether the HOA was handling pickup and delivery themselves. He clearly assumed, the way any reasonable vendor would, that the property listed on an official-looking flyer had been properly arranged with its owner. I didn't call him back that day. I let it sit 2 more days, then returned the call and told him, plainly and without elaboration, that he was welcome to drop the basket wherever the HOA had instructed him, since I had no role in organizing the event. He thanked me, sounding a little confused, and didn't ask the obvious follow-up question. Nobody ever did, that whole spring. People hear what the flyer tells them to hear. I heard secondhand, again through Marjorie, who I'd come to realize was the only person on that board still asking the right questions, that the topic came up briefly at the HOA's regular monthly meeting in late April. A board member named Hal Driscoll, an older man I'd nodded to at the mailbox 100 times over the years, apparently raised the question of whether anyone had gotten written confirmation from the Hadley fellow before the flyers went out. Donna's response, according to Marjorie, was that she'd handled it, that I was fine with it, and that the board didn't need to relitigate something that was already moving forward with 60 RSVPs and a news crew confirmed. Nobody pushed further. Boards rarely do, once a project has enough momentum behind it and someone confident enough is standing at the front of the room insisting it's already settled. The following week, a reporter from the local paper called my cell phone, found through the county's public property records, same as anyone could find them, which I've always appreciated about an open recording system, even when it's mildly inconvenient. Her name was Brenda Calloway, and she was working on a feel-good piece about the HOA's charity picnic. Wanted to confirm a few details for the article before it ran that Friday. I kept my answer short and exact, the way I used to answer questions on the witness stand the 2 times my old job required it. Confirmed my name. Confirmed I was the recorded property owner. Said the ranch had been in my family since 1958, my father before me. She asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I had anything I wanted to add about hosting the event. I don't have any comment on the event itself, I told her, 6 words. I'd practiced saying less than that for 34 years, every time a client asked me to speculate about something the record didn't actually support. She thanked me and hung up, apparently satisfied, the way people are satisfied when they hear what they expected to hear and don't think to ask the follow-up question that would have unraveled everything. The article ran 2 days later under the headline, Ridgeline Estates hosts Spring Charity Picnic for Children's Hope Fund, with a single line near the bottom identifying me by name as the property's longtime owner, and not one word suggesting I'd had anything to do with organizing it. That phone call mattered more than Brenda Calloway ever realized. It put me on the record, in writing, in a published article, confirming ownership of the land roughly 10 days before the event, and conspicuously not confirming that I'd approved its use. Anyone reading that article afterward would see exactly what I'd left out and exactly how loud that omission became once the rest of the story caught up to it. The week of the event, the trucks started coming, a rented stage on a flatbed trailer, the kind with the hydraulic legs that leave divots in soft ground. Tent crews, a company van for the bounce house rental, tires cutting fresh ruts across the eastern pasture my father had kept ungrazed and undisturbed for the better part of 6 years to let the native grass recover. I stood at my kitchen window and watched 4 men in matching polo shirts hammer event day parking signs into the ground along my own fence line, redirecting traffic through a gate that wasn't theirs to redirect anyone through. On Thursday, 2 days before the event, a landscaping crew showed up uninvited and mowed a wide swath through the tall grass along the southern edge of the field to create what I assume was meant to be a more presentable walking path for guests. The diesel mower leaving stripes across ground that hadn't seen a blade since my last hay cutting in September. I watched from the porch, coffee going cold in my hand, as a young man in earbuds worked methodically back and forth across land he had absolutely no idea he had no right to be touching, humming along to whatever was playing, utterly unbothered, because nobody had told him there was any reason to be. I photographed all of it. Timestamps, file names, a short written log I kept in a notebook the same way I used to document discrepancies on a chain of title. Tuesday, 4:10 p.m., stage delivery, eastern pasture. No permission requested or granted. It felt strange, in a way, documenting trespass on my own land, like it was somebody else's case file. But that's exactly the habit that had kept my family's title clean for 68 years, and I wasn't about to abandon it now because the trespasser happened to live 200 yards from my porch. The morning of the event, I was up before sunrise, same as always. I walked the eastern fence line in the gray light, coffee in hand, and found my gate, the heavy one, the one my father had hung himself. The one I'd always kept padlocked except during cattle moves, standing wide open, not unlocked, cut. The chain lay in 2 pieces in the dirt, and someone had zip-tied the gate itself fully open against the fence post to keep traffic flowing through for the day. No note, no call, no knock on my door at 6 in the morning to ask whether that might be all right. I stood there for a long moment in the cold air, looking at the cut chain link still glinting faintly, where the bolt cutters had sheared through galvanized steel. My father had bought that chain in 1979, the same week he bought the truck that finally replaced the old Ford that kept stalling on the access road. It had outlasted that truck, and the one after it. It had outlasted my mother, who passed in 1994, and it had outlasted my own marriage, which ended quietly in 2003 with no real animosity, just two people who'd grown into separate lives. That chain had been part of the fixed architecture of my entire adult life. The kind of object you stop noticing because it's simply always been there, doing its one small job without complaint. Somebody had walked up to it that morning with a tool meant for exactly one purpose, and decided my property line was simply an inconvenience, standing between them and a good parking flow. I crouched down and picked up both pieces, turning them over in my hands, the cut edges still sharp enough to catch the early light. There was no note. No apology waited under a rock. Just two pieces of severed chain and a gate hanging open on a hinge my father had welded himself, the kind of clean, deliberate damage that told you exactly how little thought had gone into the decision, and exactly how much confidence the person doing it had that nobody would mind, or notice, or be in a position to do anything about it even if they did. I photographed the chain from 3 angles, same as I'd photographed everything else that spring. Wide shot showing the gate and the post, a mid-range shot of the cut links lying in the dirt, a close-up sharp enough to show the clean shear marks where the bolt cutters had done their work in one motion, not several. I wrote the time in my notebook. 6:14 a.m. No frost on the ground yet, but close to it. The kind of mid-May morning that still carries winter in its bones until the sun's been up an hour. I didn't say a word to the volunteers already arriving with folding tables as I walked back toward the house. I got dressed in the same flannel shirt I'd have worn to check fence on any other Saturday, because I'd already decided this was still going to be an ordinary morning on my own property, regardless of what anyone else had planned for it. By 9, cars were lining both sides of the county road. By 10, the bounce house was inflated on my hayfield, and Donna Ashcroft was standing at the edge of it with a cordless microphone in her hand, welcoming 60 strangers onto land she had never once asked me about. The field smelled like cut grass and fryer oil from a food truck somebody had parked near the loading chute. A breeze kept tugging at a string of charity banners stretched between 2 fence posts that weren't designed to hold anything heavier than barbed wire. Kids shrieked somewhere behind the bounce house. A volunteer in a Ridgeline Estates polo shirt waved cars into a makeshift parking row that ran straight across ground my father had reseeded by hand after the '06 drought. I walked the edge of the field slowly that morning, the way I'd walk it on any ordinary day, except this time there were 60 strangers between me and my own fence line. Nobody recognized me. I was just a man in a flannel shirt standing near the gate, and for the better part of an hour I let myself be exactly that, invisible, unremarkable, watching a charity event unfold on my hayfield, the way you'd watch a documentary about somebody else's life. The feed store owner I'd spoken to on the phone caught my eye near his raffle table and gave me a friendly nod, clearly still under the impression I had some hand in organizing the day. I nodded back and didn't correct him. There wasn't anything to be gained from it yet. A volunteer I didn't recognize, a heavy-set man in his 60s wearing a name tag that read Greg, asked me if I knew where the extra folding chairs were being stored, mistaking me for someone connected to the event simply because I was standing near the gate looking like I belonged there. I told him I didn't know, which was true, and he thanked me anyway and wandered off toward the stage. It struck me, watching him go, how easily an entire morning like this gets built on nothing but assumption stacked on assumption, nobody checking, nobody asking the one question that would have unraveled the whole thing 6 weeks earlier. Everybody simply trusting that somebody else, somewhere up the chain, had already done the asking. I thought about my father a great deal that morning, more than I expected to. He'd never have approved of a stranger's bounce house sitting on his hayfield, but I think he'd have approved of the patience, of waiting for the truth to declare itself, rather than forcing the issue early. He used to tell me that the loudest man in any property dispute is rarely the one who ends up holding the deed at the end of it, and standing there watching Donna work the crowd with the easy authority of someone who believed entirely in her own version of events, I understood exactly what he meant by that. Maybe for the first time in my life rather than just nodding along the way I had as a boy. Donna stood at the small stage, working through a list of sponsor names with the easy confidence of someone who had done this a dozen times and never once been interrupted. The news camera operator had set up near the gate, getting wide shots of the crowd, the banners, the kids' faces. I stood off to one side near my own fence line, arms loose at my sides, watching the way you watch weather building on the horizon. Not afraid of it, just patient, waiting for it to arrive on its own schedule. Then she said it. She'd been at the microphone close to 10 minutes by then, working through a list that seemed to grow longer the further into it she got. The feed store, a local insurance agency, a dentist's office 2 towns over, a credit union, each name drawing a small ripple of applause from somewhere in the crowd. She thanked the volunteers by name, thanked a woman named Patricia for organizing the face painting, thanked the food truck owner for donating a portion of his proceeds. The crowd was warm, attentive, exactly the kind of audience that makes a speaker more expansive than she might otherwise be. And Donna clearly felt it, her voice climbing into the easy cadence of someone who knows she's landing well. And then, with the kind of warm civic pride reserved for ribbon cuttings, she gestured out at the whole sprawling spread of tents and tables, and said it directly into the microphone, directly into the news camera's open lens. And of course, a huge thank you to our wonderful neighbor for generously donating the grounds today. Ridgeline Estates is so proud to call this community home. A scattering of applause moved through the crowd. Somebody near the bounce house whooped. A child clapped both hands over her head the way children clap at things they don't entirely understand, but sense are meant to be celebrated. She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. She'd said generously donated, on camera, to a reporter who'd called me 10 days earlier and printed an article in which I'd said nothing of the kind. I want to be honest about what I felt standing there. It wasn't anger. Anger is loud, and it burns fast, and it makes you do something stupid in front of a camera. What I felt was closer to the feeling I used to get examining a title and finding the one missing signature that unraveled an entire chain of ownership, a kind of quiet, settled certainty. Because I understood, standing in that field, that I hadn't needed to do a single confrontational thing all spring. I hadn't needed to march up to that sign in April and tear it down. I hadn't needed to call Donna and demand an explanation. Hadn't needed to post an angry comment on the Facebook event. Hadn't needed to block the gate or call a lawyer or make a single public scene. All I'd needed to do was let her keep talking. Every piece of what happened next had already been built, brick, by her own hand and her own voice, while I stood by and let the record assemble itself. The Facebook event page, still live, with its ticket sales and its claim of a donated venue. The newspaper article, dated and printed, in which the actual owner confirmed his identity and pointedly confirmed nothing else. The voicemail from the feed store owner, still sitting unplayed on my phone, assuming an arrangement that never existed. The cut chain on my eastern gate, photographed from 3 angles before sunrise. The tire ruts across 6 years of recovering native grass. And now this, her own voice, on a recorded news broadcast, in front of 60 witnesses, claiming a donation that had never been offered, requested or granted by the one person with the legal standing to grant it. I thought, standing there, about something my father used to say whenever a neighbor's cattle wandered onto our side of an unclear boundary back in the 70s, before either of us had thought to hire a surveyor to settle it properly. He never chased the cattle off himself. He just opened the gate wider, let them wander further in, photographed the whole mess with an old box camera, and waited for the neighbor to come looking, at which point the conversation about who actually owned what tended to resolve itself a great deal faster than it would have if he'd marched over with a shotgun the first afternoon he noticed. He called it letting a problem finish becoming a problem before you try to solve it. I hadn't thought about that lesson in probably 30 years, and there I was, watching it play out almost exactly the same way, just with a charity flyer instead of cattle and a deputy instead of an angry neighbor at the fence line. This is the part most people don't understand about property law until they're standing in the middle of it. A piece of land doesn't care how long you've been treating it like it's yours. It doesn't care how convenient the boundary line is, or how many years passed without the actual owner saying anything. Using someone else's property as though you have the right to control it, directing where people park on it, what gets built on it, who gets invited onto it, even temporarily, is a legal claim called conversion, and it exists independently of whether the owner ever raised his voice about it. Add in the part where money changed hands on the strength of a false claim about who controlled that land, and you've moved from a property dispute into something a county attorney takes considerably more seriously. None of that required me to do anything except keep my hands in my pockets and let the facts keep happening in front of enough cameras. I'd made exactly one call, asking anyone to intervene, the county sheriff's non-emergency line, not to Donna, not to the HOA board. The day before the event, I'd called the county sheriff's non-emergency line and spoken to a dispatcher in the same flat, procedural tone I used to use closing out a title file. I told her there was an advertised public event scheduled to take place on my deeded property the following day, that I hadn't authorized it, and that I'd appreciate a deputy stopping by at some point during the afternoon, purely as a precaution, in case anything needed to be documented or addressed. No drama in the request, no accusations. Just a property owner asking for a deputy to be in the area. Sheriff's Deputy Roy Tyndall arrived a little after noon, driving slow down the county road, parking his cruiser at an angle that let him see most of the field without blocking the parking row. He didn't rush in. He walked the perimeter first, the way you'd expect a man who'd worked this county for 20-some years to walk it, taking in the tents, the banners, the food truck, the crowd, before he ever said a word to anyone. I watched him pause near the eastern gate, the one with the new zip tie, still holding it open, and look at it a moment longer than he looked at anything else. He found Donna near the raffle table about 10 minutes later and introduced himself, unhurried, the way a man introduces himself when he already knows exactly how the conversation is going to go and isn't in any rush to get there. He asked her, calm as reading off a grocery list, whether she had written permission from the property owner for the event currently in progress. I watched her face do something I recognized from 2 years earlier at my front door, that same recalculating look, except sharper now, with an audience starting to gather at the edges of the question. "This is basically community land," she told him, loud enough that a few nearby parents turned to listen. He's never minded before. Everyone treats it that way. Deputy Tyndall didn't write anything down yet. He just nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's heard a version of that answer plenty of times before in plenty of other contexts, and asked a second question, just as level as the first. "Do you have anything in writing? Email, text message, anything signed?" Donna's eyes moved across the crowd for a second before she answered, the way a person's eyes move when they're hoping somebody else will step in and rescue the moment. Nobody did. We've never needed anything formal before. It's an understanding." "An understanding with who?" Tyndall asked. She didn't have an answer to that one. The silence stretched a beat too long, long enough that the food truck's generator humming nearby suddenly seemed louder than it had all morning, long enough that even the kids near the bounce house seemed to sense something had shifted in the grown-up world around them and went quiet without quite knowing why. Deputy Tyndall turned, scanned the crowd, and found me standing where I'd been standing most of the morning, near my own fence line, in my flannel shirt, looking like nobody in particular. "Are you Walter Hadley?" he asked. "Recorded owner of this parcel?" "I am," I said, stepping forward for the first time all day. I reached into my jacket pocket and unfolded a single sheet of paper I'd printed off 2 nights earlier, a clean copy of the recorded deed, book 412, page 86, my name on it in the same plain language it had carried since 2009, the same parcel description my father had carried since 1958. I handed it to Tyndall without ceremony, the way you hand over any document that's simply going to speak for itself once somebody finally bothers to read it. He looked it over for a long moment, unhurried, comparing the parcel description against something on the small notepad he carried, then asked me a follow-up question I hadn't anticipated. Whether the property had ever been formally annexed into the subdivision at any point since the original 1987 plat, or whether any easement agreement existed granting the HOA event use rights even informally. I told him no to both, and that I could provide the recorded plat reference if the county needed it for their file. Book 1140, page 23, filed nearly 3 decades after my father's original purchase. He wrote the reference down without comment, the kind of small, careful notation that told me he'd dealt with boundary disputes before and knew exactly which details would matter later if this ever moved past today. He looked up at Donna, then back at me. "And no permission was given for today's event?" "No," I said. "Nobody asked me. I found out about it from a sign zip-tied to my own gate in April." A murmur moved through the nearest cluster of parents, the kind of low sound a crowd makes when it realizes the story it walked into this morning isn't the story it was told. I noticed Hal Driscoll standing near the edge of the gathering crowd, the board member who'd apparently raised the right question back in April and gotten waved off for his trouble. He wasn't saying anything, just watching, arms crossed, with the particular stillness of a man who'd seen exactly this outcome coming and had no real satisfaction left in being right about it. Our eyes met for a moment across the field. He gave a small nod, more weary than triumphant, and looked away. The field went quiet. In that particular way, a crowd goes quiet when it realizes the story it walked into isn't the story it was told. A few people near the stage had their phones out before Deputy Tyndall finished his next sentence, recording without quite meaning to, the way people do when something is visibly turning into something else. "Ma'am," Tyndall said, turning to Donna, his voice still flat and unhurried. "This event needs to conclude immediately. Continuing to operate on private property without the owner's consent is trespass, and given that donations were solicited publicly based on a false representation about who controls this land, that's likely a matter for the county attorney's office, specifically how those funds were collected and whether anything actually reached the charity they were promised to." Donna didn't argue. There wasn't anything left to argue with. A recorded deed in my hand, her own voice on a news camera saying generously donated, a cut chain photographed before sunrise, and a deputy standing between her and 60 confused volunteers who were starting to realize none of this had ever been properly arranged. She packed up the folding table nearest her with quiet, mechanical movements, loaded a box of raffle tickets into the back of her SUV alone, and left before most of the tents had even come down. Nobody clapped, nobody jeered either. It was just an unremarkable, deflating end to a morning that had started with a microphone and a crowd, and ended with a woman folding a table by herself. I watched her walk back across the field one last time, past the bounce house, slowly losing air now that someone had switched off the blower, past the food truck where the generator had finally gone quiet, her stride still carrying the brisk efficiency of someone trying very hard to look like nothing unusual was happening, even as a dozen pairs of eyes tracked her the entire way to her car. She didn't look back at me. I don't know what I would have said if she had. There wasn't any version of that conversation that needed words at that point. The deed had already said everything that mattered in fewer sentences than either of us could have managed standing there in the trampled grass. I didn't gloat, and I want to be clear that's not false modesty. There wasn't anything to gloat about. I spent the next hour helping a couple of elderly volunteers I recognized from church carry chairs back to their cars, because they hadn't done anything wrong except show up to help with what they'd been told was a properly arranged charity event. One of them, a woman named Inez who'd known my father, asked me quietly if I'd been upset about the whole thing. I told her I wasn't upset with her. That was true. She held my hand for a moment longer than the question really called for, the way older women sometimes do when they're not entirely sure what else to say, and told me Earl would have handled it exactly the same way, quiet, patient, letting the truth do the heavy lifting instead of his temper. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just thanked her and helped load the last of her folding chairs into the trunk of a sedan that had seen better decades. By early afternoon, the field had mostly emptied. A few volunteers lingered near the food truck, talking in low voices, the kind of conversation people have when they're trying to piece together a version of events that makes sense of what they'd just watched. Greg, the heavyset volunteer who'd mistaken me for an organizer that morning, caught my eye one more time on his way out, and this time, something in his expression told me he'd put it together. He didn't say anything. Just gave a small, embarrassed nod, the kind that stands in for an apology nobody quite has the words for yet, and walked on. A few days later, I made a phone call of my own to the Children's Hope Hospital Fund listed on the original flyer, simply to ask whether the HOA had transferred any donation proceeds from the event. The woman who answered checked her records while I waited and told me, somewhat puzzled, that they had no record of receiving anything from a Ridgeline Estates fundraiser that spring or any other time. I thanked her, wrote the date and her name in my notebook, and didn't pursue it any further than that. Some things are better left for the people whose job it actually is to ask the next question. My sister Carol called from Tucson the following week, having heard about the whole thing secondhand through a cousin who still lived in town and apparently followed the local paper's Facebook page closely enough to catch the follow-up article. She laughed for a good 30 seconds before she could even get a full sentence out, then told me our father would have been insufferably proud. The kind of pride that doesn't announce itself, just settles in and stays. I told her I hadn't done anything except keep quiet and read paperwork, the same thing I'd spent 34 years doing for other people. She said that was exactly the point. About 3 weeks after the event, Marjorie Quint drove out to the ranch on a Sunday afternoon. She sat with me on the porch for the better part of an hour, brought a folded letter from the HOA board, A formal written apology, acknowledging the event had been organized and advertised without the property owner's consent, and confirming that Donna Ashcroft had resigned her position as events chair, effective immediately. There was coffee involved, the kind you make out of habit more than need, and we didn't dwell on it long. Marjorie mostly wanted to know the chain on my eastern gate had been properly replaced. I told her it had. She nodded like that answered something larger than the question itself, then mentioned, almost in passing, that the board had voted unanimously to add a single line to their new member orientation packet going forward. A reminder that the HOA's authority extends only to platted parcels within the recorded subdivision, nothing more. I didn't ask whether that line existed because of me, specifically. Some things you let stand without confirming. I never filed anything against Donna personally, never pursued the county attorney angle any further than the deputy had already set in motion on his own authority. Some men might have. I'd spent 34 years watching exactly what taking something that far does to two people who used to be neighbors, and the chain on my gate was already fixed. The rest, as far as I was concerned, belonged to whoever wanted to carry it forward from there. I did hear, eventually, that Donna and her husband sold their house in Ridgeline Estates and moved to a smaller subdivision on the other side of the county sometime that summer. The kind of quiet relocation people make when a place has stopped feeling like the place they thought they were living in. I didn't take any satisfaction in hearing it, and I want to be honest about that rather than pretend at a generosity I'm not sure I fully felt. It simply was what it was. The natural conclusion to a chain of decisions she'd made entirely on her own, decisions I'd had no hand in beyond declining, politely, twice, 2 years apart, to hand over something that was never hers to ask for. It's October now, the grass gone gold across the eastern pasture, the tire ruts from that spring mostly grown back over, just a faint shadow in the soil if you know exactly where to look. I walked out to the gate this evening the way I do most evenings, checking the new chain, the one I bought myself this time, heavier gauge than the last, the kind that doesn't give to a pair of bolt cutters without a fight. My father used to make this same walk every Sunday after church, not because anything was usually wrong, but because a man who doesn't know his own boundaries doesn't really know what he owns. I understand now why he never skipped a single Sunday, rain or shine, in 46 years. The walk was never really about checking for damage. It was about reminding yourself once a week exactly what you were responsible for. I think about the deed sometimes, folded back into its fireproof box upstairs, book 412, page 86, the same plain language it's carried since before I was born. People spend a great deal of energy these days arguing loudly about what belongs to them, posting about it, recording themselves saying it, convinced that volume settles questions that were really only ever going to be settled by what's written down somewhere quiet, filed correctly, decades before the argument even started. My father knew that without ever putting it into those words. I spent 34 years learning to put it into exactly those words for other people. And it took a woman with a microphone and a borrowed bounce house to teach me I'd known it all along, sitting right there in my own kitchen drawer. I latched the gate and stood there a moment in the falling light, cattle moving slow in the far pasture, the way they do at dusk, unbothered by any of it, the way cattle are unbothered by most things that don't involve feed or weather. Behind me, beyond my fence line, the first porch lights of Ridgeline Estates were starting to come on, one by one, a whole neighborhood settling into its evening completely unaware that any of this had happened, or that it mattered. Two communities, sharing one boundary line, both of them now permanently on record about exactly where that line sits, and exactly whose name is written on the paper that says so. I locked the new chain, and I walked back toward the house.